I have a set of slides full of emojis. I thought I'm going to leave you with graphs and pie charts. So what I've designed is a talk around emojis. Hopefully they're the right choice, but let's see how we get on. I was very flattered to be asked to be the keynote speaker. I must say that I've spent my career in commercial. I've worked in ITV and a number of other businesses in program distribution and production, and also in technology. So I come at it from that lens. I feel like I'm on reasonably solid ground in that space, maybe not so solid when it comes to some of the industries that you work in, but bear with me, and hopefully some of my perspective can strike a chord. It's a hell of a question. Does broadcasting have a future in the internet industry? You're not going to be too surprised to know the answer is, of course. But I want to try and identify 4 areas, if you like, that I think the broadcasting industry need to think about to prepare themselves for some of the challenges that are taking place. And hopefully I've got enough time to start to look at the technology industry. And I've segmented the technology industry into 2 areas. One, they're all 800-pound gorillas, but the 800-pound gorillas on one side are the traditional online and mobile gorillas. And then I've separated the over-the-top 800-pound gorillas as well. So if we've got a little bit of time, I'm going to try and tackle some of their strengths and also some of the challenges that they might face. Okay, if I may, over my aging process, I've become grumpier. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but bear with me for a second. The whole thing about being grumpy is that I've become increasingly grumpy about 2 specific areas. I don't know whether it's hit you. One of them are acronyms. And over the last few years, I've been amazed at how I've tried to keep up with. I've had to work hard at keeping up with the plethora of acronyms that we're all being thrown at. DSPs, SSPs. CPIs, RTBs. It seems as though the technology lunatics have taken over the industry asylum. And if that wasn't hard enough, and I've tried to keep up with that, what I've also noticed is definitions seem to be changing. The definition of a subscriber seems to change. I used to think that a subscriber used to pay for something and got a channel or got a set of services, and there was an exchange. Now, that's not true anymore. Subscriber could be someone just who likes something and gets an occasional email. That qualifies in certain technology ecosystems as a subscriber. A channel. A couple of weeks ago, I uploaded 2 minutes of content on YouTube, only to discover a week later that that's defined as a channel. Or a viewer. And again, according to YouTube, a viewer is 3 seconds of continuous viewing. Now, I think the technology industry has done really well at tackling definitions, at establishing scale and competence, and how they have attracted consumers through channels, through subscribers, through viewing. And congratulations to them. I think they've done a terrific job. I think one industry, and just to give you a parallel on how definitions can change attitudes, is the newspaper industry. And I spent a bit of time in the newspaper industry, and one thing I will say is, if we think in broadcast and technology, we think we've got problems, these are all high-class problems compared to where the newspaper industry has fared over the last 8 or 9 years. But one of the things that they decided to do is create a definition for charging consumers for quality journalism. And they came up with a paywall. They didn't call it just pay, they decided to call it a paywall. It's never ceased to amaze me how definitions can somehow create a sense of, hold on, this is easier, this is somewhat harder. So as I go through the talk, hopefully some of that will resonate with you around definitions and positioning. Okay, enough of the grumpiness. Overall, I am, and I have been, very impressed at how the broadcast industry has reacted to, and I'm going to go back to the 2008 recession, because there were a number of choices that while I was at Disney at the time, I kind of moved from Disney to Endemol around that period. We expected, either as program distributors licensing film and television shows and kids programming, to producing game shows and reality programming, that the broadcast industry generally would make a couple of very key decisions. They'd either go down the austerity route, they'd put the brakes on, reduce spend in high quality programming and increase their use of their libraries and increase their rotation and repeats, or they would double down and spend money and invest in programming. And I think that television has never been, the quality of television has never been as good as it is today, in my view. And so it's a credit, I think, that the vision for a number of major players across Europe was to continue to invest in quality programming, sustain audiences, and in many instances, in fact, in most instances, hold on to that very significant advertising pie that the broadcast industry have commanded for many, many years. So even though we know the big winners in advertising revenue has been the digital business, it's very much been at the cost of the print industry rather than the broadcast industry. So credit to them where credit's due. And that whole approach has enabled them to maintain audience, deliver reach, and deliver strong continued investment into programming. So there's been a lot of talk when you assess programming around quality programming. And clearly these three shows, Game of Thrones and House of Cards and Breaking Bad, are classic examples of some of the world's best quality programming. But I think, for those of us in the room, I think we know that this kind of programming does not feature in the top 20 or 30 of top shows that drive a broadcast schedule. And even when I was licensing, at the time, very significant shows like Desperate Housewives and Lost and Grey's Anatomy, however good they were, and at the time they were very strong shows, the challenge was always competing against some of the traditional local genres of soaps, factual programming and reality television. In particular, live, we've seen this huge push, continued push within the broadcast networks of live television, of course, because it's an appointment of view, and we know that's important. And we shouldn't forget sport as well, and how important sport is to a number of these schedules. Drama, and also news and current affairs. That's the staple diet. When you look at the success of the broadcast industry, you have to take a step back and say they doubled down. They're really invested in programming. Credit to them. And again, even though I may use as a reference the UK marketplace, you can see those examples taking place in a number of different markets across Europe. So quality content clearly continues to play an enormous card in the way in which you can sustain audiences and monetize, not just advertising, of course, but licensing your content into other markets and creating a valuable and strong library. The second thing is I want to just briefly touch on consolidation. I joined the media business in 1983. I worked for London Weekend Television. That was my first proper gig. And at the time, there were 15 regional contractors selling ITV. 15. And the 16th was TVAM, for those of you who remember the way in which it was structured. And over a period of 15 years, you began to see continued consolidation from 15 individual sales organizations plus TVAM into one. And I have no doubt that that consolidation has created a much stronger commercial ITV. Clearly, some advertisers were concerned about that position, but right now, no one's talking about that because the #1 ad sales operation in the UK is Google, and I think Martin Sorrell last week in Cannes confirmed that Facebook either this year or next year will be the second largest media business that they spend money with. So in a sense, even though there was some caution and concern about how consolidation was going to impact choice for advertisers, we clearly are seeing a real shift in dynamics in the way in which the market is moving. But this kind of approach, the avoidance of what I remember being called casualty planning, the only way a media agency could deliver a national campaign was to take off one or two of the regional ITV contractors, punish them, rotate that punishment every year, and in a sense, deliver a national campaign that was topped up with other media in those markets that didn't get any of the budget. Much harder to do when you're one ITV. Much harder to do when you have the scale of Sky and the channels that Sky represent, and clearly much harder to do when you look at Channel 4's sales organisation, which includes the UK TV business as well as the BT TV business. So that consolidation has created a much stronger monetization, and we all know that broadcast predominantly, although most of the networks are trying to diversify, advertising revenue is key, and I think consolidation has played an important part in making sure that they can retain as much of the revenue and market themselves against other media. There's some discussion about whether the newspaper industry are going to leave their editorial egos by the door and come to this kind of conclusion. There's been some speculation. And I'm sure that if they had done, and if they do, that will enable them to compete much more heavily. Not against themselves, because I think that battle's gone. It's more against the major digital players. And the other thing that I just wanted to briefly mention is how we've seen consolidation and continued investment in this industry. ITV acquiring a number of distribution businesses and production businesses, most recently Talpa that runs and owns The Voice amongst a number of other shows, Liberty Global acquiring Virgin, Virgin acquiring TV3, Sky bringing together UK, Germany and Italy, and a whole host of other acquisitions and consolidation plays. And in my view, I think the battle isn't there anymore. I think you do have some very large players that no doubt will get bigger, but really the battle is somewhere else, and I'll mention where I think some of those big battlefronts, those battlefields are going to play out. But this is, I think, another example of how a number of major players across Europe have diversified. And when Adam Crozier stands up and presents his ITV results, I think I'm right in saying that 45% of total revenue is now away from advertising, generating from program sales, over-the-top revenue, merchandising and licensing, and channel distribution. So real diversification. So I wanted to, is it all great? I think if I was in the broadcast business, what would keep me up at night? What are the challenges? And I want to propose to you that there are four challenges that the broadcast industry really need to think about. And the first one to me continues to amaze me, how a business that has such a significant ecology and such a reliance on data, there continues to be, in my mind, a paucity of data in the way in which audiences are measured. I mean, here are a couple of questions. Who's watching the commercials, and what do they do when they watch a commercial? Those are the two fundamental questions that brands, advertisers, agencies are really seeking to try and discover. That's where the tech business is. The tech business that makes it in one place and farms it around the world have become incredibly capable and competent in being able to answer certainly the first question, and in many, many instances the second question. Now, let's take the UK for an instant and look at the UK audience measurement system. Launched in this country in 1981 with 3,000 homes that were there to represent the total consumption of television viewing. At the time, 3 channels. Fast forward to today, 5,100 households, 12,000 people, represent the viewing consumption of 65 million people in the United Kingdom. Now, if television was invented today, Silicon Valley would never put that kind of structure in place. There are millions of devices that would inform a broadcast business, who's watching, where they're watching, what device they're watching, and what do they do after they watch something. And so what we face is I think, a real challenge in how we view data in the broadcast industry, or how the broadcast industry views data, and how the technology industry views data. And I'm also reminded that the best-selling car in 1981 was the Ford Cortina. And I think in your mind, and certainly in mine, just think of the Ford Cortina running around today, slightly souped up, resprayed, furry dice, and I think that challenge for the industry, really, we need to think about. Not just the first phase, which is who is watching in real time, but secondly, what actions do they take? Key issue. Second one is the incredible rise of media agencies over the last 15 years. I mean, when I joined the business, media agencies wasn't the sexiest place to be. It was the media owner. That's the business that was almost holding 85% of the revenue of the advertising. When a commercial was acquired, media owners kept 85%. The advertising agency kept 15%. 12 of it approximately went to making the advertising. 3% was the execution of media. You are now seeing the 6 major global media agency groups now delivering better margins than most media companies. How did that happen? And I think the media agencies have done an incredible job in diversifying, credit to them, in recognizing the potential growth of digital, and investing enormous sums of money in becoming incredibly smart and efficient in ad technology services, and the whole area of arbitrage, being able to buy a digital campaign for $100,000 and selling it onto their clients for $200,000. I mean, a lot of this has been discussed in the US most recently, where the ANA, the equivalent of the ISBAR here in the UK, is questioning the amount of information that is being out there being shared by media agencies. But the agency world is getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And I think this is another key challenge for the broadcast business, is how do you muscle up, how do you compete against the 6 major groups? And WPP is just an example, but clearly the other 5 are incredibly strong. Thirdly, fragmentation. That's the best I could come up with on an emoji with fragmentation. Bear with me. I credit the industry in coming up with an approach of assuming that not everything is going to happen in linear television, and creating a multi-device catch-up experience. I think that's fantastic. Credit to them. But that fragmentation will result in a reduction in pricing. And so we haven't seen that game play out. And as the media agencies are pushing broadcast television into the programmatic arena, that's another issue that we'll certainly need to face. And then lastly, I think we need to see more consolidation. It's quite apparent to me that you know, when Yahoo, who generate over $5 billion in revenue, over $1 billion in EBITDA, and have a very significant capability in a number of areas, not least mail, are not big enough to play in the industry. So if that's a great example of a business that requires consolidation, I think that one of the things that we will most likely see is further broadcast consolidation across Europe. Okay, so very briefly on the gorillas, I've categorized it in 2 groups. I've given, on the left-hand side, Facebook and YouTube, and clearly on the right-hand side, the over-the-top operators. For the purposes of both sides of this, there are clearly many more players, particularly on the OTT side that are emerging. Major Hollywood studios, big content players, and not least Perform Group. For those of you who know a little bit about Perform Group, Perform is looking to build the sports Netflix globally. So I think they are the major players. Very quickly, on Facebook and YouTube, the key question for me is, can they migrate from short form programming to mid to long form programming. I think the jury's still out. 2 reasons. One, they don't like to spend money on commissioning programming. And secondly, there's no evidence to suggest that long form programming works in that experience. So I think the programming, the content piece is unclear to me, but there is a huge push towards video because the pricing in the digital world, the traditional display online pricing is collapsing. So all of the digital players are moving towards video. And then secondly, with Amazon Prime and Netflix, I think, by the way, when I was thinking more about this, what a perfect merger of these 2 businesses. And again, I think consolidation will sit in major businesses as well as some of the smaller operators. I'm slightly more bearish about over the top. I think when you look at the Netflix economics, I was reminded that they generated $2 billion in revenue in Q1 this year and generated $28 million of profit. They have significant pressures on cash flow. They need to push up their ARPU, and they need to make more local programming, and only 15% of their programming is original, and still a large proportion of that is US programming. So I'm not persuaded that both of these industries are going to automatically win, but clearly formidable competitors. So thank you very much for your time. I hope that's given you some food for thought and the opportunity to chat further. Thank you.